In this episode, guys, we're going to be talking about strength exercises to improve your hockey drag flick. This is something I get asked about all the time because drag flicking is such a key skill, particularly in a sport like hockey where it accounts for a really high proportion of the overall goals scored. And in the last couple of Olympic Games, it's been a really high proportion of goals scored from penalty corners. So if it's a skill that means you can get a much better outcome as a team, you can score more points, win more games, then the skill of the drag flick obviously becomes super important, and the strength exercises that underpin this are also going to be vital if you're going to try and maximize your performance in the skill, because you might have the technical execution but might lack the physical attributes to deliver it with a high level of precision, accuracy and power. So that's really what we're going to try and look at in this episode. So when we're looking at a skill like a shot or a drag flick, there's a few things we have to consider. One is the fact that it's a rotational movement in nature. So the force is being produced in a manner at which it's rotating through the spine. There's a split stance position. There are a number of factors to consider there, and therefore the strength exercise you pick have got to meet the needs of this type of movement. The more specific the skill, the more specific the movement has got to be to contribute towards the skill execution. And we're going to look at something called dynamic correspondence in just a second, which is where the more specific the movement becomes, the more relevant it's going to be and the more it's likely to transfer to the skill itself. So when we look at something like a drag flick or a shot, a few things to consider. One is the fact that it's a high speed movement. Two is there's movement characteristics like a split stance position with a rotational component through the trunk. And there's also things like the shoulder and forearm to consider when we're looking at strength exercises as well. So dynamic correspondence refers to the more specific something is, the more it's going to transfer. This is what we mean by the correspondence of something. So, and a simple example would be, and I'll talk about this in more depth in a second, but a bicep curl is less relevant to a drag flick than a rotational throw, because the contraction types, the muscle groups involved, the rate at which force is produced and the direction of force, and you'd also include then the size of the force being produced, is just nothing like the execution of the movement of a drag flick. So it's very unlikely to transfer across. Whereas if we take something like a medicine ball throw, it's probably going to be a bit more specific because it's meeting more of the needs of the movement characteristics and force characteristics of the skill of drag flicking. So when we say contraction types, we mean, as an example, a concentric contraction, i.e. the shortening of a muscle under tension. If the movement is largely concentric, then a movement that is also concentric is more likely to transfer in this dynamic correspondence concept. Muscle groups, again, very simply, are the same muscle groups used or not. If you're using a movement which has got completely different muscle groups than the skill we're trying to transfer to, it's going to become pretty difficult to make that a transferable exercise and transferable from a skill acquisition perspective. The rate of force is effectively how quickly the force is produced. So is it produced slowly? Is it produced really quickly? That will determine how effectively we can transfer across. And finally, the direction of force. So in other words, how is the force being transferred through the body? Is it what we would call distal, i.e. away from the body towards the center line of the body, or is it the opposite? And these things make a big difference in terms of how transferable a movement's going to be. So as an example, if a movement is very rotational in nature, but we only ever work in the sagittal plane, it's, again, difficult to make that transfer as effectively as if we use both high-load sagittal plane movements and complementary rotational movements that probably are going to transfer a little bit more from a rate of force and contraction type perspective. One small caveat here is that the most important thing to consider is not just the skill, but also the kind of underlying baseline an athlete's coming in with. And the more or the younger the athlete is, or the less training exposure they've had, the more general in nature training should be. So what I'm not saying in this is that a young athlete who's never trained before, who hasn't really strength trained before, should be doing highly specific movements. I don't think that's the case at all. I think building a base of generalized movement patterns in the fundamental movements around squatting and hinging, for example, is going to pay huge dividends in the long run from not just an injury prevention perspective, but also performance. So if you aren't working out towards controlling your body weight initially through basic patterns and then loading those basic movement patterns up to around a 1.5 times body weight, lower body force expression, then that really is going to be more important as an athlete from an injury prevention and performance perspective than trying to get super specific on the outcome of the type of exercise we're looking at. So let's have a look at an example here. So if we take 3 different movements, we've got a bicep curl on the left here. We've got a front squat in the middle, and we've got a rotational medicine ball throw on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, if you think about the contraction types used in a bicep curl, it's a combination really of concentric and eccentric, depending on the type of tempo being used. So it's not purely a concentric movement like a drag flick. Muscle groups used, again, it's primarily it's an isolation movement of the bicep muscle group itself. So again, doesn't meet the needs of the drag flick, which involves the quadriceps, the trunk musculature, the shoulders, the forearms, the adductors undergo a lot of tension. So really not meeting the needs there. Rate and size of force, again, nowhere near as much force being produced, nowhere near the rate of force being produced, because it's typically a very slow hypertrophy focused movement. So it isn't ticking that box either. And then last, the direction of force is also not the same. There's not a rotational component. The force isn't produced from a proximal to distal phasing, in other words, from the center of the body and out. The force is isolated in one muscle group only. And as we move across, if we start looking at things like a front squat, although the contraction types are becoming a bit more similar, they're still not the same. Muscle groups, there's more muscle groups being involved now, so we are at least training the full body, which makes it more relevant. But again, the rate and the size of the force isn't the same, and the direction of force is not the same again either. But again, just to caveat this, a movement like a front squat or a back squat is a brilliant way to develop generalized lower body strength. And something like a front squat is also an amazing tool for training the whole body from a trunk and posture perspective as well. So can be an amazing tool from an athletic development holistically. But if we're looking to transfer really directly, we're going to look at something like a medicine ball throw. And this is where it becomes more relevant when we're looking at rotational based movements, because a medicine ball rotation throw is going to include, again, concentric action only. The muscle groups involved are going to be nigh on the same, because it's going to be the same movement pattern. So what we call the kinematics, the movements are the same. The rate and size of force is going to be very, very similar again, because we're trying to throw at high velocity, at a high rate, trying to throw a light to moderate load as quickly as possible. And again, in a drag flick, the movement is very, very fast. And then the direction of force, again, is the same. We're trying to produce force from the lower body. So we're trying to produce force into the ground. The force coming back out of the ground into the body is transferred through the kinetic chain, out through the trunk, out through the arms, and into the medicine ball in order to propel it. So again, it has more similarity. And again, we're not saying this is the same as a drag flick. It's not really the point, because if we're trying to exclusively get good at drag flicking, then the majority of the time should be spent trying to improve the drag flick. But these are complementary movements, and the more specific we can get, the more likely we are to make it transfer across. So lastly then, exercises that can be used to improve the drag flick. We're looking at things like split squats, because again, the split squat nature of the movement means we can get strong in a similar base position there. And again, that's a more general movement, because the rate of force and the direction of force are not the same. But again, this is all very caveated, because we also need to have that baseline of generalized strength. Something like a split stance jammer press is really useful, because again, we're trying to use similar movements, similar muscle groups. We can bias this very concentrically again by making it more of a throwing based movement. Things like lateral GHD trunk flexions, the obliques of the body, the muscles down the side of the trunk, play a huge role in a movement like a drag flick. So it's important we train those in a flexion based movement. And then I think also things like banded trunk rotations, particularly trying to bias the concentric action, where again the tension increases as we are rotating, would be really good examples. And what I've done in an article I'll link below is go into more depth here. There's a video of these different exercises, and you can look at that in more depth if you wish. And if you've got any questions on what we've covered off in this video, let me know down below, and I'll be able to get back to you very, very soon.